Okay, so welcome everyone to our I-CBT Friday discussion group. I'm Mary Hosbrough, one of the co-facilitators along with Margaret McCall and Sylvie Levine. We're a group of clinicians who meet regularly on Fridays to share information about learning I-CBT, to expand awareness and healthy discussion. Thanks so much for being here and being a part of this. If you are new here, or if you're watching the recording, I want to share a little bit about our format for these meetings. Some Fridays we have general open I-CBT discussions, and other times we've had presentations about the modules from the clinician's manual or special presentations on special topics. And most of those have been recorded and are available on the website, icbt.online, or on the YouTube channel. And I'll drop those links in the chat once we get started. If you found your way here for this event live, it was probably through the I-CBT Facebook group for clinicians and researchers. So that's where you can find what the events are each week under the events tab in that group. And starting January 17th, we're going to be using this time as a book club to read and discuss the new I-CBT self-help book, Resolving OCD by Fred Artema. So I'll drop a link in the chat to purchase that if you haven't already as well. And I hope that you'll join us for that. It's an exciting time to be an I-CBT clinician. Today, we are going to have a special topic presentation by Fran Kuehn, who will be sharing about his doctoral capstone project, researching self-efficacy of clinicians who are learning I-CBT. So I'll ask Fran to introduce himself and share about his project in a moment. If you can save questions for the end, there should be time for Q&A. And as always, keep in mind to make questions general about concepts rather than client-specific questions, and definitely avoid sharing any details that might be identifiable about a client. There are a lot of consultation groups that are ongoing, and we also have consultation during the open discussion sometimes. So there's lots of places that you can ask case-specific questions. So welcome, Fran. Thanks so much for sharing with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mary. I really appreciate it. And I do presentations on things all the time. I'm always the most nervous when it comes to presenting in front of colleagues. So thank you for upping my own anxiety level today. But no, it's really great. Thank you. No, it's great to kind of share, at least to be at a point to share at least some of the work that I've been kind of plugging away on for the past couple of years now, and that this group in particular has just been so instrumental to the success of this project, because without I-CBT, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be doing this with this. The stars really aligned at the right time, and helped me kind of really find find purpose in using the I-CBT approach to use as a as the subject of this study. So I'll tell you a little bit, just sort of big background picture about me to start off. That I started my career as a social worker in a public high school just outside of Boston, Mass, in a town called Brookline, and spent 19 years as a school-based mental health clinician, kind of addressing every problem known to humankind that can show up in the school. But also kind of never really being able to do a super deep dive into any of the things that we had to figure out how to treat or manage. Started a private practice a while ago now, about 16, 17 years ago, and was doing kind of general social work type work. But over time, I would come into contact with kids at both the high school and in my practice that had OCD, and it was the most challenging situation that we had ever had to figure out how to deal with. Encountering kids in the high school who were, afraid to touch the stair treads on the stairs, so they'd be climbing up the stairs using the handrails, and lots of other situations that I could tell you a bunch of stories about. But in general, the idea was, of all the problems that we had kind of figured out how to address, OCD was one that didn't have much of a solution. So I really got very interested in treating that condition and did all the trainings, did all the things as you do to learn ERP and start to treat it in my practice, probably about 7 or 8 years ago at this point. But I always felt like there was something missing with the ERP approach. I had done a lot of training in classic Beckian CBT, which is where the comment about stoicism came from. But and felt that was super powerful and really loved CBT, but knew that it was inappropriate for OCD, and the behavior-based therapy of ERP kind of worked. I kind of enjoyed it, kind of didn't. Same for my clients, and it just sort of felt like we were bumping along without like the real solution, or what felt to me like a more comprehensive solution. So I got sort of fed up of working in public schools and in that environment after 19 years, and decided to leave, and went to higher ed, where I had spent a bunch of time adjuncting, but took a full-time role in a state college, where did sort of a re-dive into my MSW degree again, having to teach graduate students again, kind of the principles of research and social work practice and so on, and was looking for a doctoral program. And long story short, took a couple of tries, but I got into this program at University of Buffalo, School of Social Work, that has a focus on implementation science. So I'll share my screen, and I'll let you know a little bit about how this all came about, and how I'm now at a point where I'm using implementation science to do a study on self-efficacy related to the I-CBT approach. So preliminary findings here from some work that we've done so far. I don't know why I say we when it's all me, but it feels like a we, because we've got a good team of advisors and a great cohort of people that are in this program. So the focus of the program is something that you may have heard a little bit about. It certainly makes sense when you do, called implementation science, which is a scientific method of facilitating the uptake of evidence-based practices. This is writ large. Part of the problem with research in general is that you have a lot of PhDs who are doing original research and who are finding either good, positive outcomes or no outcomes, or whatever it is, whatever information they're gathering from their PhD search, doesn't make it to clinical practice. There's a really long gap. It's thought to be about an average of 17 years between bench and bedside. The idea that somebody figures out something and there's a generation that passes before anybody actually gets to use it anywhere, and that the vast majority of new research, over 80% of it, actually kind of dies on the vine. It doesn't really make it anywhere, and unless there's folks who are deeply immersed in those worlds that think to kind of drag it out and figure out what to do with it. A lot of the time, this gap persists. So the entire philosophy behind implementation science is to try to reduce that gap. How do you figure out, how do you get people to uptake these evidence-based practices and get them into use and measure whether or not they're working in those environments? So we have this big glut, and that's where we're kind of coming in. And I knew for me that I really wanted to focus on doing something, having a product, an intervention, or something that really made a difference with people on the ground, people who were like actually trying to figure out how to do this work. So we looked at developing a self-efficacy study, and this is inspired by being a part of the I-CBT group and others that I've been a part of over the years, and the idea that online learning in general has totally taken off since COVID, but we don't really know a whole lot about whether or not online learning works and what sort of circumstances we need to create to really enhance the likelihood that somebody's going to learn something from an online program and learn actually how to put it into practice. And when you look at clinicians in private practice, those who don't work in hospitals or schools or clinics, the gap is even wider, because there's so many more obstacles and barriers to people who work for themselves or work in a small group practice to learn how to do new interventions. As we've been talking about, you can pay to go to trainings. There's a limited budget for that. Most of us will go to trainings, take notes, throw everything in a drawer and leave it there. So, we know that just going to these things and being exposed to them isn't usually enough to help people who don't have a team or a cohort around them learn how to do something new. So, what I really kind of leaned in on was this community of all of us who are really passionate about reducing the suffering related to the condition of OCD, and how, through the research that I've had to do, you recognize this is obviously a worldwide condition. There's so many parts of the world that don't have anybody who knows how to treat this condition. It's considered the 10th most disabling health condition, not mental health condition, but health condition worldwide. And as this group knows, the degree to which other people can get pulled in to an individual's compulsions really reduces the functioning of an entire family or community system in a lot of places around the world. But of course, here domestically too, in all the ways that we see it show up. So the thing that had really kind of drove me over the edge when it came to a commitment to I-CBT was recognizing that there were clinicians with lived experience who thought that this model really solved problems for them that ERP, couldn't really touch. And the second that I saw that happen, I thought, well, geez, there's no way I'm not going to focus on doing something that people who have OCD think works best for them. So that was really the inspiration behind it. And to know kind of also writ large that the idea of selecting the study to focus on something like self-efficacy among clinicians is also based on the limitations of the research and the program that I'm in. There's no budget for this. I don't get to hand out $50 gift cards for people who do the surveys or show up. It all has to be done. It doesn't have to be done for free, but but I have no resources to actually run the project outside of whatever energy I put into it. So there's no grants that support this. There's no SAMHSA money or anything like that. So it becomes necessarily a little bit limited in terms of what we think about studying. And if you've ever looked at what it takes to get through an institutional review board approval to do human subject research, that it's way more difficult and complex to work with clients than it is to work with clinicians. So clients, there's so many special protections that have to be taken, and so many resources that have to be put into place, that you start to understand why only bigger clinics or labs or whatever have what it takes to pull off research on the sort of the outcome studies of implementing these practices. So instead, we switched it around and thought about outcomes for clinicians. How do we start to think about and measure the degree to which clinicians might develop this concept of self-efficacy when it comes to learning how to do something new. And so we started out on project timeline here for me, big picture back in fall of 2022, actually after getting waitlisted, not once, but twice from the program. We got started in that fall, did a year of basic coursework, problem identification, preliminary study designs, and then last fall, really starting in earnest with the advanced coursework, project design. The choice to focus on I-CBT happened back in the spring of 2023. Got through institutional review board approval this past July, started recruitment in August, and got about 65 people who demonstrated some interest in participating in what we had offered, which was going to be a 6-session, 12-hour cohort called the Virtual Professional Learning Community, something that we were going to ask people to be a part of and to commit to for the length of the project as much as they could. So we started out with this big number of 65 folks and then wound up with about 25 committing to participate. And that was mostly because of logistics and finding a time for everyone to meet, because we wanted to have the meetings live. So we got about 25 people to sign up for a meeting, and we began those in September and wrapped them by the end of October. So we had 6 of those sessions. They were 2 hours in length. And I'll go through in more detail if people want. But if you think about the 12 modules of the I-CBT approach, uh, yeah, we wound up doing 2 modules per session that we had, and then we had to have all these measures that we used to both address the principles of self-efficacy, which I'll explain in a second, and then some other things, some other research questions that came up with through that. So wrapped everything with the project itself in October, and have been collecting and analyzing data and writing papers about all this stuff ever since, including, as recently as this morning, and what we'll go into next week and through the spring too. So not quite done yet, especially since we have a longitudinal arm to this study where we're going to assess whether or not that self-efficacy among clinicians has persisted about 3 months after the end of the intervention. And the guidelines that are out there would normally suggest waiting 6 months to really see whether or not that those gains have persisted. But because of the limitations of the project and the fact that I really want to graduate in May, we're stopping it in January. So we'll wind up sending a third round of time 3 surveys and quizzes and things to the participants then, and hopefully get a good enough return on our surveys that it'll be significant. So once that's done, in the spring, we'll do all the bivariate analyses and write a final report, all fun with two-tailed t-tests and coefficients and significance, and hopefully we'll get some results that communicate that we did something with some effect here. So some of these slides, I have to apologize, I did kind of slap them together a little bit, but I wanted to give you at least some more information about what's happened in the study. This is a survey these are responses rather to a survey question about what states people practiced in. And I'll do like maybe a pie chart or something like that will show, as we can see, that a good number of people did come from Massachusetts, but we've got plenty in the tri-state area, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, but all the way down to Maryland too, Michigan, up in New Hampshire, over in Texas, Georgia, Oregon, and as far away as China. So we did not restrict this to people practicing in the US. We just looked at people who were licensed as clinicians who wanted to participate. So speaking of, one of the things we're measuring is this concept of reach. How many people were we able to get to participate in this intervention? And were the strategies that we used to create the intervention effective at getting more people to participate? So very simply, what we did was make it free. And so we're asking, one of the research questions is, did making this free help people access this intervention? So what did we do? We created a cohort. I recruited, again, about 65 people. We got about 25 to agree to participate, and we developed a team. We established some norms and boundaries, did some introductions, and then really got to work with the I-CBT model using 2-hour meetings, that 6 of them over Zoom on subsequent Monday nights. We recorded the meetings, and for individuals who couldn't attend but wanted to participate, we would send them the recordings and all the materials after the fact, and they would fill things out on their own. So we did not reinvent the wheel here. We use the resources that are freely available to everybody who's interested in learning I-CBT, and that meant relying on the module presentation videos that are available on the website. I didn't change any of them. I didn't modify the order of them. Really just sort of said, here's what we've got. Let's run it through and see if this makes any difference. And I am aware folks like Bronwyn and others have made adaptations to the order in which they present their modules. We didn't look at that as a question of effectiveness. We didn't compare those two conditions to see which one was better or worse. Although we might assume, based on history and modifications and wisdom that, yeah, probably the delivery is getting better over time, but we just used what was already there. We actually took the quizzes from the handbook, and got permission from the publisher to use the quizzes as a part of this study and turn the quizzes into knowledge checks for the clinicians. So after each module presentation, they'd watch the video and then they'd take the quiz. And when everyone was done, we'd come back and then we'd have a discussion about it. We'd check our knowledge, we'd do some Q&A, do some talk about some cases as time allowed. And often time was pretty tight, so we didn't have a huge amount of sort of supervision or consultation time, although we tried to get to it here and there. So we do a little bit of feedback and Q&A, but we also did a pre-test and a post-test, and we'll do this 15-week follow-up on not just knowledge checks about the model, but about questions related to self-efficacy. So what are we assessing? Reach, like I said, is the extent to which we can get people to even participate in this, and how do we remove barriers to participation. We're looking at the concept of self-efficacy, which is an older one by Bandura from 1997. His definition of this, which includes motivation. And so I had to create a scale asking questions related to people's motivation. Confidence, again, had to create a scale related to people's feelings of confidence with doing something that's challenging or new. And then competence. And we used two methods to assess for competence. The first, as I mentioned already, were the quizzes from the modules. And the second was a scale that I created based on the online supplementary material that Fred has that explains the sort of psychological underpinnings of the I-CBT approach. So crafted some questions based on that and created a scale for competence. Interestingly, as things happen here, snafu occurred with the survey, the first survey that asked questions regarding knowledge of the I-CBT approach. It actually, the survey dropped one of the questions that actually show up in later, like time 2 and time 3. So it created a bit of a snafu around, are we actually going to be able to measure what we set out to measure if we missed one of the questions? So in a panic, I emailed Fred this morning, who is kind enough to get back to me to assure me that if we had 5 out of the 6 questions as I had written them, that he thought that we covered the construct of competence with I-CBT model. So that's all I need. And hopefully that's all my advisors will need to let me keep going here. But that's why you see the little asterisk there, is that we had a little bit of a problem with that. So we create these different measures, and we ask people to rate themselves on these before we begin with the virtual professional learning community, at the end of the intervention, and again at 15 weeks follow-up. We combine all these subscales into a total self-efficacy scale, and then we can measure the degree to which that self-efficacy has increased or dropped or remained the same over the course of the intervention. We're also asked some questions regarding psychological safety in terms of being in a group of learners. Did people feel safe taking risks? Did they feel comfortable kind of being in a vulnerable place where they're learning something and may not quite know the answers? So we wanted to make sure that we created an environment that was conducive to that. And then the questions of how are we assessing these things? Well, a lot of survey data. A lot of these studies will rely on that. So we had to create all these surveys, again, create scales based on kind of predominant ways of understanding the constructs of what does competence mean, what does confidence mean, what does motivation mean, and then break those into questions and submit them in survey data. that we did again, pre, post, and 15 weeks follow up. And then looking at using pretty standard statistical methods to assess for differences between each of these times, establishing again that longitudinal arm. And it's important to note that many studies that are out there, both on impacts on OCD sufferers as well as other concepts, do not have this longitudinal component. So I'm pretty excited that we'll get to ask that question and see whether the efforts we put in to something like learning a new practice persist over time or not. And then, what gets in the way maybe or not of that too. We're looking at one-time data collection on reach, so how many people were we able to get involved with this, and whether or not people felt safe as in the virtual professional learning community. And that's is that all I've got? No, I've got more for you. What have we got so far? So, the timeline of this has involved not just running the study and creating all these measures and everything else, but doing a whole other course worth of work on dissemination, spread, and scale of evidence-based practices. So that'll be things that I think about and probably chat with all of you about in the coming months. But it's been slow to turn around all the data and the way that they set it up in the program. We look at the preliminary descriptive statistics now, and then in the spring, we'll look at, again, those bivariate analysis, whether or not there's a difference between time 1, time 2, time 3. Do we have significant improvements in people's self-efficacy? And I can, though I don't have results from those analyses yet, I can show you some raw scores, which I think will indicate that there's likely a difference, but I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So over the course of the 6 weeks, we maintained a pretty high level of participation among folks, even those who couldn't make it every week in the live session because life happens, would often follow up, watch the videos, ask questions, do the surveys, and so on. So we were able to maintain about 24 people per session over the course of those 6 sessions, which is really nice. And it tells us something, I think, about the commitment of the people that were there and their level of interest and how great they were, frankly. And we have data from time 1 and time 2, so pre and post, on questions of self-efficacy, which again include subscales of motivation, confidence, and competence. We have time 2 data or post data on psychological safety, and some other questions that we asked that we're not going to evaluate, but are just good to have in terms of what was helpful in the learning experience, what wasn't so helpful in the learning experience. And I've got some feedback from participants in that regard too, which I can share. And we have time 2 data on the second part of the reach, which is really a question of as a result of participating in this virtual professional learning community, I feel more prepared to implement the I-CBT approach. So we're hoping that that number is pretty robust at the end. Again, we'll see what it is. They say in this work that even if you have a null finding, like you're still adding to the scientific literature. So regardless of what happens, we'll hopefully fill in some gaps here. And then, so what do we got here? And I apologize again, because I sort of slapped this together and didn't use the same format. So I looked at the responses to the question of competence. And I mentioned that I had to kind of consult with Fred to make sure that the questions we had regarding competence were still going to be good, even though we missed question 1, or the first survey missed question 1. So all of these are based on the responses to questions 2 through 6, which I can show you if you're interested. But really looking at time 1, we had a mean score of 7.17, which tells us out of a possible I think total score at that point would be something like 22. Um, if somebody said, I feel like I know everything about I-CBT completely, they get like a top score of about 22, I think, although I'd have to double check on that. And so at the very beginning, the confidence level was pretty low, or competence level rather was pretty low at just about a 7. After the 6-week, after the 6-session intervention, 12 hours of I-CBT exposure, we now have a mean that's up over 17. So much, much closer to people saying and indicating that they have a high degree of competence with the I-CBT model. So in that way, I think we're going to be able to show that as a function of participating in the virtual professional learning community, that people can develop competence with an evidence-based practice. And though that might seem really kind of on the nose, there's a lot of assumptions that we tend to make about how that sort of thing happens that we're trying to answer. We're trying to unpack a little bit more here, and showing that it does work, in fact, is actually kind of nice too. This is the other question I mentioned. So again, this is just raw data. I copied and pasted in here this morning. We only had 16 people respond to this question, but it is as a result of my participation, I feel more prepared to implement the I-CBT approach. And the answers they could give were on a scale of 0 to 100. Actually, on the survey, you take a little bar and you slide it over almost like an infinite scale to say, here's where I feel I am on that. So you see the numbers are pretty robust. There's one maybe outlier. I don't know how we got a 10 in there, but maybe somebody did feel like only 10% in terms of prepared to implement. But a number of 100s here, a bunch of 90s, and we'll do an analysis. We'll do some descriptive, I'm sorry, some measures of central tendency, as they're called, on these to kind of show on average where things are at. But those raw numbers are pretty encouraging when you're looking at people who are saying that they're ready. And we have a bunch of comments on the qualitative side in terms of how people felt about the experience. And again, know that if you yourself appeared in any of those videos, asked questions, did a presentation yourself, like you are now part of the research. So give yourself a pat on the back, because we asked this question: what was most beneficial to learning I-CBT? And the discussions were mentioned, the videos quite a lot, the resources, handouts, the case presentations, watching the videos, a little bit about case discussions, going through the modules as a group and practicing in session, watching the modules and talking about cases. You kind of like everything that you folks have been doing here for a while. Broken into modules that one can easily follow with their client. So a lot to say about how effective the materials already are. The discussions and videos, discussions, the basics around some of the content here. The slides, right? So I use to present, I use the same slides that are on the website, the adult I-CBT slides, just going through those with folks. Group discussions, wonderful examples. And you can see the response from people is pretty positive here. So I think the other thing that we're kind of measuring is the quality of the work that you all have done. If you've had a hand in any of this, which should indicate, quite a lot of great stuff coming out of it. And we managed to kind of pull this off in a somewhat organized way anyway, despite the fact that we've had a couple of small problems here and there. This has really been, a solo project again, zero budget, lots of effort and time, but I think, we'll come out with a nice project on the end. So that's what I've got for presentation slides anyway, and they're happy to hear folks' thoughts about it, answer other questions, even take suggestions or feedback, which is always welcome, whatever works for you folks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fran. Yeah, that's so So interesting. I did see one question in the chat, so I will go ahead and read that, but then invite everyone to just either raise your digital hand or unmute yourself, and we can just have a organic conversation here. Someone asked, are language barriers an issue in implementation? For instance, if English is not a first language, would that affect sense of efficacy?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Stephanie. Yeah, I think in the, you read through these articles and there's always a section on like discussion and you talk about the limitations and implications of the work and so on. So a lot of that is going to come through there where we look at, why is it that we had people even choose to participate, right? That I think one of the things that I would think about is if people were choosing to do something like this, that they probably have a high degree of self-efficacy already. And although it's worth it to measure that. And to your point around language barriers, I think one of the other assumptions might be that that person, that individual, may already know that they possess a language barrier, but that they feel that they are able to overcome it in order to access this new learning. And we did have a couple of participants who clearly English was not their first language, who were wonderful participants in the project. So I think it's an interesting question. To what extent does not having proficiency in the primary language impact one's self-efficacy with something? We can certainly imagine how it could, right? We're not measuring that directly in this study, though.
I guess I don't have a specific question, but it's just so interesting to me. I wish that there had been some sort of like researcher looking at like the grassroots dissemination of I-CBT among us, this group that's sitting here, that it's just been so unique. I think if I'm under, I don't know a lot about implementation science, but I think this just has been a unique process, and we're right in the midst of it. And then also when thinking about like how do we learn, there's also a huge shift happening right now with the release of the self-help book that is going to shape how clinicians are providing I-CBT as well, even though it's not targeted at clinicians. So it's just like so fascinating to me. So thanks so much for just getting the wheels turning, Fran. And like there's so many potential questions that are just like so enthralling to think about.
It's an interesting project because it's kind of meta, right? It's like, well, let's measure what we show up and do here all the time, to one extent or another, or can we reconstruct what you folks have done and then measure whether or not it made a difference? And hopefully we'll get to a point where we can say yes, and that part of the implications are going to be to say what are the elements that made this successful, and then that should inform future training. And whether, so what methods, process, length of time, whichever, should be implemented to create an ideal learning environment, right? And so what do we learn from that? But Stephanie, you have your hand up?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Stephanie Woodrow, and then I saw Stephanie Thomas also raise hand. So you've got two Stephanies competing here.
I was right both times.
Um, Fran, this is awesome. I'm so excited that you're doing this, and I can't wait to see the final outcome. Mary actually started to say something exactly related to my question, which was, have you asked Fred if he sees there being any change in terms of training or how things are delivered with the release of the new book and things like that? Like, I know you said obviously some of us do the modules out of order, but most of the time when we train people, we do it in order. So I'm just curious if Fred has had any feedback or anything like that.
No, it's interesting. One small piece, he spoke to, as I shared with him the dilemma I had around the questions this morning, was that the question in particular that didn't get populated in the survey was, to what extent do you understand the difference between what is an obsessional and a reasonable doubt? And he had said, there's updated language related to obsessional doubt that is in the book. that they're kind of leaning on here as the new language. And we know language is one of those things that has changed with the I-CBT model, right? That it went from a vulnerable self theme to now a feared self, and a different explanation of what a vulnerable self is in contrast to feared self. And that I think what we're living is the ongoing iterative and reiterative process of testing and trying and finding some results, and collaborating collegially, sharing outcomes and ideas, and then refining what we do. And that is a part of implementation science on the evaluation and iteration end. So in a lot of ways, you folks are well advanced in this, because you're well beyond the uptake of this as an evidence-based practice, and you're in the real like developing wisdom phase about it too. And I think, to your point about Fred, I think one of the greater benefits he's got is this cadre of clinicians who are out here doing all this work and trying to measure the impact of their efforts, because that helps him write the next volume of the book too. So it's an entire ecosystem of people who are learning how to do something new. And I do think that this won't stop, right? There's no reason why this should stop in terms of how we develop new knowledge and awareness and approaches. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and just one thing I'll add, you said, that no matter what, stuff adds to the body of research. When Susan and I did our case series, at the very end of it, we both turned to each other and we said, if we were designing this today, we would do it completely differently, right? And she's like, oh yeah, we would. Somebody's got to get the ball rolling, and I'm really glad that you're doing this. So thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Great comment, Stephanie. And then Stephanie.
Yeah, Fran, I am so impressed that you're doing this, and thank you. I keep going back to that efficacy graph that you had and going, and maybe I missed it in the presentation because I was driving home from work. So the people who were in your group were actually using I-CBT as they were learning it, or were they just learning it and then deciding to implement it?
That's a really good question. Yeah. So the idea was we were not asking the clinicians whether or not they were using it with their clients, and we were not asking them to measure whether or not their clients were getting any better through using I-CBT. We kind of said, use it, don't use it, whatever you want to do is fine. We're not measuring any of that. Again, the difference, if we were to start to measure outcomes with clients, it would have exponentially made what I was doing more complicated.
Yeah.
But we did have, though, anecdotally, was plenty of the clinicians were using this with their clients, and plenty of them were seeing it as kind of game changers. And we didn't ask about that experience because I didn't want to kind of open that Pandora's box. But in the sessions over email, the messages from other people, they were as excited about this approach, I think, as we all are. And, to get started and really start to see how it makes a difference with their clients. And I think that was a driver of that self-efficacy too. In the recruitment materials that we put out there, I didn't go super heavy in terms of really trying to convince people to do this. We sent the recruitment, obviously, was through this group, the other OCD Facebook group, and then a bunch of other groups and connections that I've had and made over the years. Another function of the program that I'm in, through the implementation science, has been a mandate to improve and strengthen your professional network. And so that's been a way in which I've had to put in some effort too, just to connect with people around the world who are doing this work. So that self-efficacy, I think, is driven by people's desire globally to have a solution to the problem of OCD that is a little bit more tolerable in a lot of cases, but also, I think, in a fundamental way, explains the experience of OCD more comprehensively, and in a way that I think honestly is trauma informed and helps people restore a sense of trust in themselves.
Yeah.
So, go ahead, Stephanie.
I think there was a huge benefit in having you be able to process with your group what they were learning each week and discuss it further. I'm thinking for myself in terms of learning a new technique. If I can talk about it with colleagues as I'm learning and doing, you get much better at it.
You found my
Personal
secret,
opinion.
Stephanie, which is always, always to turn into a teacher, right? And if I can turn into a teacher, then I've got to know it well enough, right?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, and I was just gonna ask Margaret, is it okay if I comment on some of the things Fran just said and then call on you? Like, yeah, I think that this is probably like one very important first step. And when you were talking about, okay, and then we're not correlating it necessarily with client outcomes, like it's like yet, like there has to be hopefully then a lot more studies coming. And I know, of course, Fred, studies client outcomes in his research, but like just as far as like from the clinician, like the implementation and clinician self-efficacy and all of those things that aren't part of some of that other research that's currently being done. It's really fascinating. One place my mind was going is like, I'm interested in like feedback informed treatment. And there is a lot of research that talks about clinician confidence actually being negatively correlated with client outcomes. And so when thinking about that, I'm thinking like, yes, sometimes that can happen and you need some humility, but obviously you need enough confidence to start somewhere and to use an approach. But then clinician allegiance to a model is highly correlated with client outcomes. And so that motivation piece and what you were describing as part of your definition of self-efficacy and people really wanting to use this model because they're allegiant to it, just seems like, oh, I wonder if that offsets, if someone gets overconfident too soon or whatever, like all these questions. I just need to start a doctorate or something myself. I don't know.
Great questions. And I think one of the things that you kind of learn pretty early on is that to measure anything, it has to be so small and so particular and so sort of attached to every other confounding variable being figured out that you wind up with this you walk in with a million questions about what you want to do and you walk out with this like very tiny answer.
Yeah.
And that's just part of the scientific process. But you raise excellent questions about to what extent does high self-efficacy impact outcomes for clients, right? Do clients feel the optimism from their clinicians? Do clients feel put off by clinicians who insist this is the one right way of doing things? Both are certainly possible and I think worthy of being evaluated.
Mm-hmm. This is a really good starting point though. So thanks for sharing it.
I'll add in the wolf study that just came out, that there was a small bit in there about the training level of the clinicians who delivered I-CBT, and that they actually found that the outcomes were really as good, just as good among those who had a lot of training and those without a lot of training. So people with advanced degrees and people without advanced degrees. And from a global impact perspective, I think it speaks to the power of potentially creating and training local counselors with or without master's degrees to deliver I-CBT worldwide in villages and in communities and in countries where there's nobody practicing.
Yeah.
Lay people may be able to deliver this content almost as effectively as clinicians are.
Yeah. Or even peers, peer to peer or something. Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, cool. Margaret?
You probably answered my question a bit because I was going to ask your participants, were these people who were already trained in ERP? Did they have training in OCD? Were they familiar with the disorder? And so you kind of addressed that a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just answer that and then we'll go from there. So the exclusion criteria were only that people did not have any formal training in the I-CBT approach already. They could have gone to an I-CBT Friday, they could have read the book, they could have done a bunch of things, but not had a sit down, let me go through and try to learn this experience. So I didn't even ask if people had experience with OCD or ERP or anything like that. It just, again, another assumption was if they were going to express interest, that they probably, at least, and so the experiences from many of the participants reflected some of that too, that some were there because it was the first time they had ever encountered someone with OCD, or they were there because they just learned that half their caseload had OCD, but they never knew how to recognize it. Or there are as wide a variety of reasons for participating as we can imagine. Sorry if I cut you off, Margaret.
No, you didn't. No, I was just, and you kind of answered the question ahead of time. I was just curious about that. I know we have a lot of members who join the group who aren't OCD specialists. They've got a client, and that's kind of how I became an OCD specialist. I got my first client and then went down that rabbit hole. So I think that's all cool.
I think our experience, in clinical practice is kind of universal. That as part of the background research you have to do for all this, you recognize that OCD is. I'm not going to say anything you folks don't already know. It's highly unrecognized in the medical community. There are studies with primary care physicians who missed 90% of the OCD cases that they were presented with. We look at the folks in the community. You present them a vignette about someone with OCD, and their reaction to that is quite negative. And then you explain, here's what OCD is, and here's what's happening to this person. And they completely change their perspective and develop empathy for the person. But you go into Target and there's a OCD Christmas sweater, right? Obsessive Christmas disorder or something. So the degree to which the general population and public does not understand the condition is still quite severe, and creates a lot of obstacles for clinicians and for sufferers to get access to treatment. And that's why reach is important here too, because we're trying to get to a group of people that are notoriously hard to gather together. These are clinicians in private practice who have to make a decision: am I going to earn money during this hour, or am I going to do a training during this hour, right? Or and maybe because I've had referrals for people with OCD and no one in my town or city or state knows how to treat this condition, I better figure out how to do this. So lots of facilitators and barriers there.
Yes, I think I-CBT is growing the field of OCD specialists for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So any final questions or comments? In the chat, there's a lot of affirmation for the work that you're doing, Fran, so it's very appreciated. Any other final comments or questions before I stop the recording here? When's round 2? Are you gonna
Yeah.
with research or following up for us, Stephanie?
I was referring to Fran's research.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to, this will all be wrapped up by about mid to late April, and anytime after that, if we wanted to do a updated presentation on the outcomes, I'd be happy to do that.
Oh, no. I mean, your next round of research.
Yeah, do you have more research you're doing?
No, I don't think so. I did not get into this to be a researcher, and it shows in terms of the quality of my work at times. It's been a huge labor, but a labor of love too. Since finding the I-CBT approach, I've felt that it's a real game changer. And when you look at the impact of all of our efforts in reducing suffering around the world, this is one pretty powerful way of doing that. And so who wouldn't want to do more of that? How much of it I'll measure, I don't know. It would be good, I think, for us all to have some data out there about what works or doesn't work in creating these virtual practice communities and developing cohorts of clinicians and keeping people engaged and motivated and helping to measure whether or not they're actually learning, and then measure whether or not they're using it. I think we could all benefit from more research in that field. I don't know how much more of it I'll do though. I'm going to be researching taking a long nap when I'm done.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you chose this for your project, and thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, everybody. It's great to share it, and I hope it came across with some coherence behind it too.
Yeah, it was cool.